Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Judith Flink. I'm chair of the Advisory Committee on Student Financial Assistance, and I'd like to welcome you to the Advisory Committee's roundtable discussion on ensuring access to college amid economic uncertainty. I would like to thank all of you for joining us in today's discussion and thank Vanderbilt for hosting us. As you know, today's roundtable will focus on the current condition of access and persistence for low and moderate income students, particularly the challenges they face during these troubling economic times. The signs of the current economic downturn are strikingly apparent. The value of the dollar has fallen relative to global standards, gas prices are at a record high levels and still rising, and wages have fallen or at best remain stagnant relative to the rate of inflation. While all families are certainly feeling the financial strain, it's especially difficult for families with low and moderate incomes. Because we know that the success of low and moderate income students is critical to global competitiveness, our nation must ensure their ability to access and persist through college. In 2006, the Advisory Committee released a report entitled Mortgaging Our Future: How Financial Barriers in College Undercut America's Global Competitiveness. This report outlined the fact that the loss of bachelor's degrees due to financial barriers in the next decade will subvert Americans' competitive stance in the global market. The nation's current economic condition makes the need for bachelor's degrees all the more critical. If America is to continue to be competitive in the global market, we must ensure that higher education is a priority. The Advisory Committee released a policy bulletin in which we updated these initial estimates of bachelor degree completion rates among college-qualified, low and moderate income students from our 2006 report. Based on the new information, it is now clear that between 1992 and 2004, a major shift in enrollment away from four-year colleges occurred among college-qualified high school graduates from low and moderate income families. The shift has occurred despite major improvements in academic preparation. Among students who took at least Algebra 2, only 40% actually enrolled in a four-year institution in 2004, compared with 54% in 1992. Among students who took trigonometry, 55% enrolled in a four-year institution in 2004, whereas 73% did so in 1992. The number of students who forego enrollment in any institution has greatly increased as well. According to our estimates, these trends are likely to result in 1.7 to 3.2 million bachelor's degrees lost in the next decade among college-qualified low and moderate income students. It's a very large number. The resulting higher loss projections provide stark evidence that unequal financial access to the The resulting higher loss projections provide stark evidence that unequal financial access to and success in college may be transforming higher education into an engine of income inequality, as many have feared. As we are all aware, the average price of attending college increases each year, even at public four-year institutions. Although there have been modest increases in need-based aid, generally those increases have not kept pace with college prices. It is estimated that the maximum Pell Grant in 2006 and 2007 covered approximately 32% of the average cost of attendance at a public four-year institution, whereas 20 years ago the Pell Grant covered 52%, over half the cost of attendance. Student aid's failure to keep up with college prices, along with the trends towards merit aid and an increasing reliance on loans, result in even greater financial barriers for low and moderate income students. These persistent financial barriers affecting bachelor degree attainment rates are of even greater concern when placed in the context of the increased financial constraints that low and moderate income families face due to the current economic conditions. The current state of the economy presents a unique challenge to higher education. Steps need to be taken now to ease the increased financial burden that low and moderate income students and families face, in order to increase their access and ensure their persistence in higher education. The first session of the day will discuss the current condition of access and persistence, focusing on possible problems within the federal, state, institutional, and private sectors. while the second session will explore solutions that have been proposed at each level. However, before we begin the session, allow me to introduce the members of the Advisory Committee. Dr. Claude Presnell, whom many of you know is the president of the Tennessee Independent Colleges and University Association and founder and CEO of the Tennessee Student Aid Alliance. We're so pleased to host today's meeting in Claude's backyard. Thank you for having us, Claude. Mr. Claire Cotton served for 18 years as the president of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Massachusetts. He is also the previous chairperson of the Advisory Committee. Mr. Allison Jones, who will be moderating our first session, is the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Student Academic Support in the Office of the Chancellor at the California State University. Ms. Noreen Fuller is the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising, or FIDM as we refer to it, as well as the Executive Director of Student Financial Services for all four of the FIDM's California campuses. Mr. Scott Giles is the Vice President for Planning, Policy, and Research at the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation. Mr. Rene Drouin is President and Chief Executive Officer of the New Hampshire Higher Education Assistance Foundation Network, which consists of 3 not-for-profit New Hampshire-based organizations. Mr. Darrell Marshall serves as Director of Student Financial Aid at Florida State University. Mr. Joe Russo is the Director of Financial Aid at the University of Notre Dame. Mr. Juan O'Connell, an alumnus of Georgia Institute of Technology, is the committee's student representative. Unfortunately, Mr. Robert Shireman could not be with us today, and he is the president of the Institute of the College Access and Success. I would also like to introduce our designated federal official, Mr. Dan Manzella, from the U.S. Department of Education. At this time, Claude will introduce this morning's guests.
Thank you, Judy, and good morning, and welcome to Nashville and Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. As a Tennessean and a Peabody alum, I am really pleased to be able to host the meeting here in Nashville and at Peabody, especially that of the Advisory Committee. As Judy mentioned in her opening comments, today's discussion will be an important one, not just for Tennessee, but for the nation as well. And I'm truly pleased to have the opportunity to bring together such a distinguished group of great minds to be able to discuss this issue of providing access for students, especially those who are the lowest income and most neediest students in our nation. A Tennessean who's truly been a tireless advocate for education is, of course, Tennessee Senator Lamar Alexander. Though he could not be with us today, we're pleased to have Michael Schultz join us to represent the senator. Senator Alexander has held numerous positions in the state and national government during his years as a public servant, serving as a college president, as a governor, and as a cabinet-level secretary. Prior to his role as a United States Senator, Senator Alexander served as the U.S. Secretary of Education and a 2-term governor of this great state. Senator Alexander is also a former president of the University of Tennessee, where he made many noteworthy contributions not only to the state but also to the students within the state. In all of these posts, Senator Alexander has continued to place an emphasis on the necessity of a strong higher education system, one that will ensure the nation's competitiveness both in economic and global activities. Currently, Senator Alexander makes important contributions to our nation in the educational system through his work in Congress. He is the chair of the Senate Republican Conference, serves as the Senate's committee on the Senate's Committee for Education, Labor, Health, and Pensions, where he is also the ranking member of the Children and Families Subcommittee. Recently, the senator issued a press release noting that the best way for our country to pull out of an economic downturn is to expand rather than limit access to higher education. As this is the focus of our panel and it rests upon this very premise, we certainly welcome representation from his office at this roundtable. And Michael Schultz, who will be speaking on behalf of the senator, is the Middle Tennessee field representative and has been working with him since 2002. And we're glad that you can join us. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Claude. Good morning. As Claude said, my name is Michael Schultz. I'm here on behalf of Senator Lamar Alexander. And I'd like to take the opportunity on behalf of Senator Alexander to say welcome to Nashville for those of you who are not from the area. And I spoke with the senator the other morning. He was in town, and he wanted to make sure that I, on behalf of him, commend the advisory committee for all of the work that they do, and that he is a strong supporter and will continue to do what he can to support you. And Senator Alexander is a strong supporter of the nation's higher education institutions and is fighting hard to protect their independence and autonomy from intrusive federal regulations. He's also very focused on helping improve the ability of students to pay for college by increasing Pell Grants and keeping Congress from adding unnecessary regulations which will drive up the cost of college. And he would also like to provide incentives to students to pursue higher education, like loan forgiveness for teachers and nurses as well. He continues to remain a strong supporter, as all of you are, I'm sure, very aware of his background, and he thanks you for the opportunity for me to stand here and address you. And I hope that while you're in Nashville, those of you who are not from here will get to experience the sights and sounds that this great city has to offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. We also have with us today Mr. John Gaines, representing the senior administration of Vanderbilt University. And we're pleased to have Mr. Gaines here to express Vanderbilt's commitment to access in higher education. John began his career in admissions in 1989 at his alma mater, Transylvania University, which is located in Lexington, Kentucky. He started out as an admission counselor and was soon promoted to the director of admissions. He's also served as the assistant vice president and director of admissions at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi. John has been with Vanderbilt since 2002, and he currently serves as the director of undergraduate admissions. During John's time here at Vanderbilt, applications for undergraduate admissions has risen to record levels, and Vanderbilt has also seen a precipitous rise in the number of applications from underrepresented populations. As well, students seeking admission to the fall 2008 freshman class are among the best qualified in Vanderbilt's history. They have higher standardized test scores, higher class rankings, higher GPAs, and more had taken AP and IB courses. So we're glad to see that John and the Vanderbilt campus is reaching out to students from all backgrounds when seeking to fill their freshman class. So thank you, John, for joining us, and we'll let you have some brief comments. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Chancellor Nick Zeppos, the faculty, staff, and administration of Vanderbilt, as well as our students from all over the country and around the world, I would like to welcome you to the Vanderbilt campus for today's roundtable discussion. It is an honor for us to host this gathering of individuals today, all of whom are committed to helping provide and maintain access to higher education and to helping students persist in their higher education endeavors wherever they may be. And today's topic, students' ability to pay for higher education, is one of paramount concern. And of course it will continue to be so as it is ever impacted by the changing economic conditions in our country. Access, persistence, maximizing the academic success of students, providing financial assistance for students to attend college, supporting them as they attend college. These are all values which I'm sure everyone in attendance today, both physically and through the electronic means, are firmly committed. From promoting program integrity to eliminating complexity in our own financial aid process to minimizing the financial burden on all students that we admit and enroll, Vanderbilt's mission reflects these same values. While quietly implemented and specific to our own particular corner of the higher education community here in the U.S., each and every one of us in our own individual institutions and as individuals can have a major impact on the lives of deserving students from all walks of life. I am, then, very pleased to share that Vanderbilt's commitment to access and our increasing financial support for needy students has resulted, as Claude mentioned, in our ability to continue to attract students from all walks of life. In fact, over the last 7 years, the average indebtedness of undergraduates from Vanderbilt has decreased by about 20%. This has been done while our cost of attendance, like the cost of attendance at all institutions, has continued to experience increases. And our culminating accomplishment in this ongoing initiative will allow us to take the significant step of eliminating need-based loans entirely, beginning with the freshman class that will enter at Vanderbilt in the fall of 2009. Any need-based loans that would have otherwise been packaged for those freshman students will be replaced by grants or gift assistance, and that will be done while we continue to operate a need-blind admission process and continue our commitment to meeting the full demonstrated need of all eligible admitted students. So we're very pleased that you're able to join us here today. I hope that your time on our campus is fruitful, that the roundtable discussion is stimulating, and that it will lead to positive action on many levels. And I hope that we will all continue to band together and work to provide access to higher education for all students, but particularly for low and middle income students across the country who are most impacted by today's economic situation. Thank you for your time, for your interest in today's topics, and again, welcome to Vanderbilt.
Again, John, thank you very much for having us here. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Allison Jones, who will be the moderator for the first session.
Oh, you have to hold it. Okay. Well, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Gaines and Mr. Schultz, for welcoming us to Vanderbilt and to the great state of Tennessee. We appreciate everything you have been doing to promote college access, and we're pleased to be able to host the roundtable discussion today in this great state at this great institution. Okay, getting used to the mic here. Now it's time for us to turn our attention to today's first session. As you know, we've gathered here to discuss what we can do to really address the record-level financial barriers to college access and persistence that low and moderate income students are facing today. As we heard during the opening remarks this morning, the rate at which college-qualified low and moderate income high school graduates enroll in college has in fact declined significantly over the last 15 years. We also know that the rate at which they don't attend college at all has increased. As a result, we are also aware that fewer students are likely to obtain or earn a baccalaureate degree. And this is very disturbing. These trends may in fact be exacerbated by the current economic conditions and increasing college prices. Because the success of these students is critical to our global competitiveness, our nation must ensure the ability for students, and these students in particular, not only to access to higher education, but also the ability to persist to the point of completion of a degree. It's not just enough to bring students in, we have to be sure that they can persist and graduate. This session today, or this morning, is going to focus on the scope and the severity and duration of the problem that we've just described. We've asked our panelists today to provide some context on how the deteriorating economic conditions may affect access and persistence problems that we have seen. Our panelists hold a variety of perspectives and represent various levels of higher education, federal, state, and institutional, as well as the public and private sectors. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists for the session this morning. Seated at the far end of the table to my left is Mr. Brett Leaf. Brett is president of the National Council of Higher Education Loan Programs, known as NCHELP. He has years of experience in student aid as director of financial aid at various public and private institutions. Through NCHELP, Brett represents a nationwide network of guarantee agencies, secondary markets, lenders, loan servicers, collectors, schools, and other organizations that provide assistance to students each year. I've known Brett for a number of years. Welcome, Brett. Next is Dr. Nancy Moody, president of Lincoln Memorial University. Lincoln Memorial University is a private liberal arts college named after President Abraham Lincoln. It serves students in the Cumberland Gap region. Under her leadership, Lincoln Memorial has experienced 6 years of record enrollment growth, has established 3 new campuses, has created several new academic programs, and Nancy is also the current chair of the Tennessee Independent Colleges and Universities Association. So welcome, Nancy. I thought California was the only state establishing new campuses. It's nice to know there's additional demand in other states. On Nancy's right, we have Dr. Eduardo Padron, the current president of Miami-Dade College, the largest institution of higher education in the United States. Dr. Padron told me riding over this morning, you have how many students? 100 and 170,000 students in that Miami-Dade college. Dr. Padron has garnered national respect for his advocacy on behalf of underserved student populations and has published numerous works on issues facing these students. At the other end of the table, to my right, I have to keep my direction straight here, is Dr. Charles Lenth, Vice Presidency for Policy Analysis and Academic Affairs with the State Higher Education Executive Officers, again an association we refer to as SHEO. At SHEO, Dr. Lenth focuses on state-level academic planning and policy, access and affordability in post-secondary education. Seated to the left of Charlie is Dr. Harris Miller, President of the Career College Association. Mr. Miller is responsible for the advancement of the public policy goals of the Career College Association at the state and federal levels, and he communicates these goals to key stakeholders and constituencies. Also with us is Mr. John Nelson, Managing Director of Higher Education, Not-for-Profit, Healthcare, and Infrastructure Rating Teams with the Public Finance Group at Moody's Investment Services. Moody's is one of the world's most respected and widely used sources for credit ratings, risk analysis, and research, and has a commitment to stable and transparent markets. John is responsible for the development of multi-year business plans and market strategy, annual budgets, credit decisions, and human resource evaluation of the rating teams that he oversees, one of which conducts research and analysis of higher education. And finally, next to John is Dr. Stella Flores, Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Higher Education right here at Peabody College. In her research, Dr. Flores uses quantitative methods to investigate the impact of state and federal policies on college access and completion for low-income and underrepresented students. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank all of you for being here today and for your willingness to help us discuss these critical issues. So welcome again. Dr. Donald Heller will be our facilitator today, leading the discussion for each of the sessions. Don is a professor of education, senior scientist, and director of the Center for the Study of Higher Education at Penn State University. His research focuses on higher education, economics, public policy, and finance, with a special concentration on issues related to college access and choice for low-income and minority students. He is also the co-editor of a book recently published, State Post-Secondary Education Research, New Methods to Inform Policy and Practice. Thank you, Don, for agreeing to help us today to guide this roundtable discussion. Now, we'd like to remind all of the panelists that this roundtable discussion is, in fact, being videotaped at Vanderbilt University. And to ensure effective sound on the video, we'd like to remind each panelist to be sure to turn the microphone on when you speak and turn it off when you have completed your comments. At each mic, does everybody have to hold it down? As we have learned, it's not you have to hold it. So I can guarantee you your finger gets tired and it will help you shorten your comments a little bit. So there's not a good outcome, I suppose, with this. Also, we'll be taking questions from the audience at the end of the session, which is a relatively new process for us. The audience members who have questions should write them on the index cards that were provided in their folders or at the registration table. And midway through the discussion, one of the members of the advisory committee staff will be by to collect your index cards. Lastly, we're going to be starting a little bit earlier. We're going to be starting closer to 9:30, of course, than 10 o'clock. So we'll likely break around 11:30, but we'll be somewhat flexible as we see how the discussion moves. I think it's going to be a very exciting discussion. So we thank you again, all of you here, both at the table and in the audience, for joining us today. We think this is going to be a very exciting, very productive, and we're very anxious to hear the discussion and to help move us forward as we address these issues, to provide greater access to low and moderate income students. Again, not forgetting we need to provide not only access, but the opportunity for those students to persist to the point of graduation. So with those remarks, let me turn to Dawn, our facilitator, who is going to lead us from this point forward. So Dawn, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Allison. I have the unenviable task of trying to keep this discussion on task, and I say unenviable because we have quite a bit of expertise between the panel members as well as the advisory committee members, and I'm sure many of you here in the audience, but I'll do my best to try to keep things on task. What I'm going to try to do is, after I say a few remarks here, is throw out some questions and invite any of the panelists to jump in and provide a response. And as Allison said, please remember to hold down your mic. I will also, in my best professorial fashion, also be willing to cold call people if I think that there's a particular question that one of you has some expertise about. Even if you haven't raised your hand, I will be feel free to call and say, would you like to weigh in on this issue? The issues we're facing today are quite great in higher education, particularly the financial circumstances. I'm not going to go through all the details. Your packets have a lot of information about the challenges we in higher education are facing. And these are challenges that have to be dealt with at the federal government level, states, certainly by our over 6,000 institutions in this country that participate in the Title IV programs, as well as private sector organizations. And in some ways, these challenges are unprecedented in that a number of different things have come together. I think that we have faced many times in the past the downturn in economic cycles that affect, for example, state governments and the funding that they can provide to institutions. We've had in the past faced changes in student loan programs. We've faced economic challenges such as the gas crisis and the gas rises in the 1970s and 1980s. But I think what's unique about today is that we're facing all of these things simultaneously, and they all have an impact on our institutions as well as our students. So with that beginning, let me start off with the first question, which is, as I said, there are many challenges facing higher education today, and there's no way that we can try to address all of them in this session this morning and then come up with the solutions in the afternoon and then walk away and think that we've done our job. But let me ask the panelists, which are the key parts of this crisis that you think we need to address and we should focus on first? Go ahead, Harris.
Hi, I'm Harris Miller. First of all, a couple corrections for the record. I'm ABD Miller, not Dr. Miller, so thank you for promoting me, Allison. Secondly, with all due respect to Dr. Padron and his great institution, the University of Phoenix has 330,000 students, so it's a little larger.
Well, the California State University has 450,000.
Then you win.
But I wasn't going to beg.
Then you win. You win. I'd say two issues. Number one, I think it's a capacity issue. I know this sounds strange when we're sitting at such a beautiful campus, but the fact of the matter is there is a huge capacity issue. And particularly when you talk about the limitations that state governments are facing and able to expand community colleges and state universities. There are, as you know, for example, in one profession, nursing profession, there's an estimated 200,000 vacancies, and yet 40,000 students a year who want to get into nursing school don't get into nursing school because there isn't a seat for them. So I think capacity is a big issue. We in the Career College Association believe that the private sector is able to help with that capacity, but at the end of the day, you're also going to need to get state governments to step up and reprioritize higher education. When Winston Churchill was in Parliament before he became the head of the government, he was in the halls of Parliament with a woman who headed the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she turned to Mr. Churchill and said, "Mr. Churchill, we've calculated all the alcohol you've drunk and determined that you would fill 1/3 of this great hall with all the alcohol you've drunk." And Churchill looked up to the ceiling and said, "So far to go and so little time." We have much to go to develop capacity because a lot of students simply don't believe that they have a chance to go on education. Secondly is an overall financial commitment to higher education. Judith put some of the numbers up about Pell Grants and said that 20 years ago it would have covered 60%. Well, 40 years ago it would have covered close to 90%. So the commitment to higher education isn't there. I'm a strong advocate of a coalition of all of higher education to put together the kind of aggressive advocacy that the medical community pulled together about 12 years ago. For those of you who follow Washington, you may remember that all the different diseases got together. Usually the diseases fight each other. Heart says, we're more important. Lung says, no, we're more important. Juvenile diabetes says, no, we're more important. And they fight each other for funding from the federal government, particularly from the National Institutes of Health. And about 12 or 13 years ago, they miraculously got together and put together a coalition and got Congress to commit to double NIH funding over 10 years. They still fight among each other, but the pie is twice as big as it was then. Higher education has started to do that. There have been some efforts to do that, but our efforts have not been all that successful. It's great that we've had 2 increases in Pell and the recent increase in the unsubsidized Stafford loan limits, but keep in mind those were all revenue neutral. At the end of the day, Congress wasn't willing to spend one more dime to support students. They shifted money from lender subsidies to increase Pell, and then they increased the unsubsidized Stafford loan limits, which actually generate a profit for the U.S. taxpayer. In neither case was the government willing to reach a consensus to spend additional taxpayer money to support higher education. That's a scary thought. That shows how weak we've been in making our case, and I think we need to create a new coalition to do that.
Let me pick up on the capacity issue and ask you, Mr. Nelson. The issue of capacity in higher education is one of both capital and operating expenditures and resources. Your organization does a lot of analysis of institutions and their capacity to be able to expand and continue their operations. What's your perspective on what the key issues are in this economy and how things may be different from what universities have weathered in the past, both public and private?
Thank you very much. I would agree with Harris that capacity is certainly a major issue. I might add another element to the view, which is that higher education, if you think of it as an industry as opposed to a public service, it has become, I think more by default than by design, but it has become a much more competitive and market-driven type of industry. And that includes, first and foremost, public universities. If you look back at the history of funding of public universities over the last 30 years, the percentage of their revenues that come from state general subsidies has declined dramatically in almost every state in the union. There are a few exceptions, but even in the exceptions, the decline is still in place. It's just not as dramatic. So when you're dealing with these organizations now, you're looking at organizations that are not looking, in many cases, primarily to the state government for the revenue. They're looking primarily to students, and they're looking primarily to other forms of revenue generation, such as philanthropy, research grants, perhaps training grants from public and private sources. As far as their ability to sustain themselves, this has actually been an advantage for them. Public universities are financially, in aggregate, at the 4-year level, stronger institutions because they're less dependent on the political decision-making of state government and are more independent, market-driven. Their managements are more professional. They have a longer-term view of their institutional health, and they're able to remove themselves to some degree from the political cycle of state legislative decision-making, where the resources that they have to compete with are typically Medicaid, prisons, roadways, and K through 12 public education. And in that game, they usually lose. If you're a legislator and you're sitting making difficult decisions, it's a kind of obvious choice to make that you're going to cut the funding or not increase the funding with inflation in the place where you're pretty sure that there's a substitute revenue source to pay for that. If you're thinking about prisoners or Medicaid, there isn't a substitute for that. So it's a much more difficult choice to make. So I would say that the largest impact of all of this has been that public university tuition has been going up very fast. As a graduate of 2 different public universities, I can say that it would have had an impact on me when I was attending college. It doesn't necessarily mean, however, that the lowest income students have to be excluded from attending public universities if these universities follow the kind of sophisticated financial aid strategies that effectively are transfer price mechanisms, where the better off students are forced and asked to attend at a much higher price in order to subsidize the cost of lower income students. It's still a bargain. And when I travel around the country, I know that Claude's counterparts point out to me very often that the median family income of students attending private not-for-profit colleges is typically lower than it is at public universities in their state. And that's because more and more upper income students are attending public universities because they're becoming more savvy in how to market themselves, and they are raising their tuition rapidly. So I would focus as one of the key elements on here the role of the public university and what it means to be more market-driven as opposed to publicly subsidized.
Charlie?
I would like to join my two colleagues here in some discussion of capacity and support many of the points you made. Let me try to draw a picture because I don't think it made it into the materials that were handed out. But we do a study, or have done for the past 5 years, that attempts to look at the total amount that state and local governments provide in support of higher education, and also the total amount that's derived from tuition revenues on that topic. We use a different set of calculations, and it's not imagining it, but you do need to visualize it in the sense that these are not numbers that can readily be pulled out of the existing data. So what we do is collect the information from all 50 states on what they're providing through taxes and other resources now, and increasingly states are drawing on other resources, and also local government support. And then we take out of that amount specialized use categories like medical education and special identifiable research and agricultural extension and things like that aren't inherent in the educational function provided by our public institutions. Drawing on historical data, we've got those numbers back to 1980, 1982. And then we calculate, as I said, a net tuition number, and we do this all on a per-student basis so that we can correct for student growth and get a per-student number of revenues generated and look at it over time. If you can visualize that diagram, we are at this point in time in this year just about at the same level of governmental support as we were in 1982. That is correcting for inflation and enrollment growth.
You're talking about on a dollar per student basis.
On a dollar per student basis. At the same time, the proportion of total support going into providing public higher education from tuition revenues has gone up from about 22% of the total to about 36% of that total. And if you take in those added tuition revenues and again divide it by the number of students, we are higher, that is, than we were in 82, but it's all as a result of those additional tuition revenues. So in some ways that's supporting this. But my point really in a lot of this is that in addition to the points around capacity, we've got a lot of policy work to do because whether reflected in the types of data that we can use, but more directly in the way institutions are funded, there are very few resources and very few rewards for expanding capacity and in bringing in more enrollments. It's essentially all retrospectively funded in some way, or the way we determine the amount of funding that goes in is done retrospectively. And we do rely on market factors and market pressures to bring in new students, but we don't have yet, it seems to me, a very explicit set of policies that will help us to increase overall educational attainment in this country. And that, I think, is an area where we need to talk about, as one of my colleagues said, trying to stimulate a new coalition, and frankly, it seems to me, more political leadership on those primary public policy issues.
I know from the work that I do that capacity constraints in higher education are really only a problem for some students. For example, upper income students in this country generally don't run into problems of capacity constraints. They can always find a seat somewhere, and usually at an institution that's a good match for their capabilities. But let me turn and get some of the institutional perspective from Dr. Padron and Dr. Moody and talk a little bit about the challenges that your institutions face, particularly with, I know both of your institutions serve large numbers of lower income and minority students. If you can talk a little bit about that issue from your perspective, and then I'm going to turn to Dr. Flores to talk about it from the student's perspective from the research that she's done. So either Dr. Padron or Dr. Moody.
thank you very much. Capacity is certainly an issue. Nursing was mentioned by Mr. Miller, and I think when you look at capacity, you have to look at the root of the problem. In the state of Tennessee, one of the things that we've tried to do is for the public and the private institutions to work together to encourage that the capacity be met by both of those entities. So it really is an issue, but the issue, at least in nursing, and I'm not sure about in other fields, has to do with the educational preparedness of potential faculty. If you don't have the faculty, the clinical resources to provide the educational opportunities for the students, that's what limits the capacity. And it's usually those two things, having adequately prepared faculty and the clinical resources for those students to practice in. I would like to say, though, in the state of Tennessee, we also, in terms of that capacity, there's the Tennessee Center for Nursing, which is a 501c3 organization that was developed to study nursing workforce issues in Tennessee. And through the efforts of that organization and the governor's office, we developed a public-private effort or initiative to provide a nursing loan forgiveness program. TCN actually had to come up with the initial funding for half of the amount that was set aside, and the state matched it. And I think some of those efforts, I know we're not talking about solutions this morning, but I think some of those public-private partnerships may help with capacity. I'd also like to say that I was talking with a colleague of mine at a state institution relative to decreased state funding and the current market that we are facing. And in the state institution, which would be different than the public institute or the private institutions initiative, they're planning to limit enrollment or to cut enrollment because they don't have the resources actually to hire additional faculty. In a private institution, our response would be somewhat different. If we can find the faculty, we will have the resources there if we have the students there. So it is a different view altogether, and I'm interested to hear my colleague.
Before Dr. Padron weighs in, can you just say a few words about the challenges your institution faces in general, not just in nursing or certain areas, but the challenges your institution faces in general at keeping an education affordable for students in today's economy, in today's circumstances?
Well, it's challenging. I do have some numbers about the percentages, but they haven't changed. They mimic the nation. 75% of our students get some sort of federal aid. We provide 20% institutional aid, 7.5% state aid or lottery scholarship, and then about 0.4 of $1 million, very small percentage, in endowed annual scholarships. Some of our challenges, and I'm not sure if we're reflective of other private institutions across the state, but I think many of them, we have 60% of our students who are first-generation college students. They are not in the affluent group that are going to have the resources to readily attend college. So we do have particular challenges in terms of educating those students and the parents about what they actually need to go to college. How do they apply for financial aid? When they come to campus, they're not aware many times of what it takes to get into college. And I know Claude and the Tennessee Independent Colleges and Universities Association, one of the first white papers that we did to try to increase the capacity in terms of higher education in the state of Tennessee is to start educating people even in grade school and middle school and their parents about what it takes to get into college. In terms of the challenges, I think the financial challenges are some of the greatest. I think there are gaps in learning when you look at educational preparedness to attend college. I think that's a great challenge for us as well.
Thank you. Dr. Padron, can you give us a perspective from, and let's get the label right here, the nation's largest single community college that's not a system. Would that work for everybody? Okay.
To me, this whole issue is one of national and state priorities. It's disappointing to me, for example, to see that, as far as I'm concerned, neither of the two presidential candidates have made this issue. It's nowhere in the conversation. At the state level, speaking for Florida, for example, it's the same thing. It's a question of priorities. We have only 22% of the financial aid programs in Florida that are need-based. And we have the infamous Bright Futures program, which I will address later if there is time, which is really, it doesn't make any sense because what it's doing, it is financing white middle class people with resources are getting a free pass, getting a free education, while we have thousands and thousands of qualified low-income students that are not getting any help. To understand, let me put it in a little bit of a framework. We're an institution where 90% of the students come from minority groups. We enroll the largest number of Hispanics and also the largest number of African Americans of any college or university in the nation. And these students are about 58% low income. 38% of them are beneath the poverty line by federal standards. So it's a rather poor student body, the largest recipient of Pell Grants in the whole country. And our situation at the present time, which is what you're addressing, is worse than ever because typical of most of our institutions, at times like this is when our enrollment is growing. We had an enrollment growth this past year of 9%. Why? Because the economy is in bad shape, especially in Florida. This is the time when the students lose jobs, when they realize they have more time now. Those part-time opportunities are gone. So more and more students are coming and enrolling. And it's at the time when we have the least amount of resources to provide assistance. It's a situation that compounds itself because the amount of assistance that we get from the state, as I said, is very limited in terms of what we can do for these students. And it presents a real difficult situation trying to help these students. We provide well over $100 million to students in financial aid, a combination of federal, state, and institutional financial aid, and doesn't even it's not even enough to even get close to the numbers that are really needed. And for our students, since we only depend on state allocation and tuition, the option of increasing tuition is not really an option because every time we increase tuition $1 per credit is the difference between putting food on the table or going to school. Most of our students are working students, the largest majority of them. Most of them, basically make big sacrifices to come to school. And every time we raise tuition, it hurts them. And this year we have to raise tuition 6%, as basically almost mandated by the state. With that said, it's also true that Florida enjoys a reputation of having the lowest tuition at the university level of almost any other state. We're probably number 49 or number 50 is rather low. But we have a Bright Futures program in Florida that basically provides for between 75 and 100% of the tuition paid, tuition and fees. University of Florida, the flagship institution in Florida, 95% of the students at that institution are on Bright Future scholarships, and only a very small percentage of those come from low-income students. As a matter of fact, the average income of the families of the students who are getting that those scholarships is well over $100,000. And I can tell you from my own experience that the children of some of my best friends who are wealthy individuals are going to that university and other universities in Florida for free. And that is basically wrong. It shouldn't be for people who can afford to pay, while you have many qualified applicants. University of Florida rejected this past year 63% of the applicants. And that doesn't make any sense if we really are going to turn this around and what I consider to be an imperative for this nation.
Let me turn now to Dr. Flores. I know that you do a lot of research on low-income students and underrepresented minority students and the challenges they face in getting to college. Can you talk a little bit about, from the work you've done, the challenges facing students in the country today?
I'm going to go back to your question, which was, what are the key issues in today's current economy, and put that in context of trends until now. And I would begin with assessing vulnerability, who are the most vulnerable students and who are the most, well, two parties I think are the most vulnerable, certain types of students and certain types of institutions. The committee has identified low-income and moderate-income, middle-income students. Low-income for obvious reasons, information constraints, unmet need, not having correct information in terms of college choice or how to begin that process. But the vulnerability of middle-income students, I think, is something we should pay attention to, and a specific portion of middle-income students, which are the ones that are first generation to be middle-income. So our country has made some progress in increasing college access, but some of these students or parents are now have made exponential jumps into middle income. And these, especially racial minorities and immigrant students, are the most vulnerable in terms of losing that middle income status, and particularly in this current economy. The most vulnerable institutions, again, and that not taking away at all from the vulnerability of low-income students, which continues to be a national priority, I think. But in terms of institutions, who are the institutions most hit? And community colleges are obviously one, and specifically a lot of the minority-serving institutions because of the demographics of the students in terms of income and so forth. But also certain state policies such as relegating remediation to community colleges that puts an extreme burden on the community college systems, which are already struggling to keep pace with their demographic growth and student growth and so forth. And also something that I'd like to mention is what is the role of the local economies, especially with these community colleges. Dr. Padron has mentioned some of the behavior that results from unemployment, but each state in our region has such different local economies to knowing exactly what effect that has on college enrollment and what state and federal policies are interacting well or interacting against local conditions, especially as they affect poor students in the most vulnerable institutions.
Thank you. If we're going to talk about affordability in higher education, you can't have that conversation without talking about student loans, obviously, for a couple of reasons. First of all, student loans are a critical part of the financing system in the country. There are, according to the College Board's data, about $85 billion worth of student loans that are being taken out every year. And also loans have become the predominant form of financial aid and outweigh grants now available to students, particularly undergraduate students. And Mr. Leaf, I know that your organization represents the groups that provide a good proportion of that $85 billion in loans. The second reason that this is an issue right now is because of the credit crunch that this country is facing, obviously not just in the student loan arena, but in many other areas. So let me turn to you and ask you, from your perspective and your members' perspectives, what the key issues are in this credit crunch with respect to student loans and how that impacts students' ability to be able to pay for college coming up this fall.
Thank you. What I would first like to do is to double back on a comment that Harris started a little while ago about commitment. And I think one of the biggest difficulties we have is an insufficient commitment of the Congress with regard to higher education policy. Somewhere 10, 15 years ago, there must have been a misspelling of a word, and somehow politics and policy got transformed. They morphed into one another. And we've been on a 15-year run of having more politics than we've had policy. It is not right that it has been 10 years since the last Higher Education Act has been passed by Congress and signed into law. And as odd as that may seem, I am less concerned as to whether it gets done by June 30th of this year or before the August congressional recess or even before the presidential election than I am that there may not be another reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and I'm much more fearful of that. And what we've had in its place, and it ties in directly to your question, is we've had two budget reconciliations. And budget reconciliations in Washington are bloodletting. It's not necessarily a discussion of policy. It's a discussion of how can we take money from one area, and I'll use a kind word, recycle it into another area. It's green. And in the interim, the public policy and the foundation of it are not really discussed. And that's basically what happened and started the eroding of student loan programs when the Deficit Reduction Act was passed in 2005. And it was followed up with the College Access Act in 2007. And between those, there was $40 billion that was taken out of organizations that provide student loan assistance. And that's a heck of a lot of money. And it means that the Pell Grant assistance that we've seen, and we will see over the next couple of years, has been funded with a one-time funding source. It's not replenishable. And I'm concerned, as Dr. Padron has said, the presidential candidates have been quiet about this. And we're probably facing in 2012, somewhere around there, a deficiency in the Pell Grant and other federal aid programs that could be tens of billions of dollars, because we're going to have to backfill the funds that have come from that one-time funding source. We're going to have new enrollments of more diverse students attending our institutions. I think the panel can agree that tuition and fees will go up over this period of time. And as tough as it may seem, at some point someone may refer to these as the sort of good old days, but with what we're faced with. And yet if you would ask us right now, none of us would indicate that. Now, I know we all stayed in a Holiday Inn Express last night, and we're going to have to try to come up with solutions for you. But the problem with student loans started when there were funds needed for other worthy enterprises. Increased Pell Grants, increased loan limits, repayment plans that were reasonable and made sense with borrowing levels. And on top of it, the subprime mortgage, other lending practices, Wall Street. When you put the two together, you've had an interaction of two very hurtful situations that have pretty much destabilized the student loan industry right now in the ability for us to move forward. If we had one or the other, we would probably limp through, and that you would not have seen the displacement that you've seen. On one hand, a number of lenders have difficulty in getting access to cash from the markets. The markets have thrown out the dog with the baby in the bathwater, and these student loans, which are good investments, are not being looked at by investors as a positive item. For the for-profit lending institutions, it's not necessarily a matter of having access to cash. They've got depositor income that they could use. With them, it's a matter of how does the lending institution reallocate the funds that bank has, and is it more worthy in mortgages, credit cards, automobile loans? And then the third factor is that one of the primary areas, a convenient area, an unfortunate area of financing post-secondary education and training over the last couple of years has been home equity loans. And we're going to see more people borrowing out of the federal programs next year. We estimate $6 billion more on a base of about $60 billion. But we're estimating maybe $6 billion more because, one, the home values might not be there to support the home equity borrowing. And secondly, the new requirements on home equity borrowing may result in parents not having access to that and taking some benefit of a tax deduction for using that for post-secondary education and training. So really it's been a matter of a couple of budget reconciliations, or what started with lack of federal policy, a couple of budget reconciliations, some markets which are not acting in a rational manner that have affected both the availability of nonprofit organizations to have access to capital, to reinvest the bonds that they have right now, and the fact that home equity loans are not going to be as popular or available to families and students. So we've got not one item, we probably have 4 items that have been put in a Waring blender. Someone hit the pulse button, and we don't like what we see when that is swirled around. And now my finger's getting tired, so I'm going to let it go.
Thank you. Let me. Do you want to follow up, Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me make a brief comment. First of all, you slipped again. Students don't just start in September. Students start year-round. Career colleges were the first people to draw attention to the student loan problem because we are the canaries in the coal mine. We had students being denied access, or at least facing much higher payments as early as January this year. So we were the first people there. But let me tell you about a surreal political situation this spring. There clearly was a problem coming, and yet it was only the Career College Association, representing the 1,250 members that we represent, and my good friend Phil Day, representing the financial aid officers, who were willing to go to Capitol Hill, other than lenders themselves, and say there's a problem. And even as recently as 3 days ago, I saw an article in Bloomberg News where representatives of the traditional higher education community said there's no problem. There's no problem with access to student loans. So there is a disconnect. And when people in Capitol Hill and in the administration say, is there a problem with student lending, and they say it's just you people in the for-profit sector, and maybe Phil and a few of his financial aid people who think there's a problem, maybe there's really no problem. So we've got to get our story straight. If the traditional higher education community, through its official spokespeople, keeps saying there's no problem with student lending, then the chances of Congress changing its policy, or the administration changing its policy, or of the presidential candidate speaking about this topic are about zero. As long as it's just a small part of higher education, we're about 8 or 9% of higher education, and the financial aid administrators, it's not going to get the attention it deserves. If traditional higher education believes there's a problem, they've got to speak up.
Let me follow up on that then with our two college leaders. There has been a lot of publicity about the student loan crisis in the last 5 or 6 months. There's no question, and I think there's been some articles that have perhaps been a little bit over the top in terms of the crisis. There are others that have been, I think, more realistic about it. Let me just say briefly from the perspective of my institution, we were told about 2 months ago that our primary loan provider would no longer be making loans for our students starting this fall. That's the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency. Now, we have about 85,000 students in our university, I think about 3/4 of whom borrow to finance their education. So we had to scramble pretty quickly to find an alternative, and we have come up with an alternative, and we feel relatively confident that come this fall we'll have enough student loans to be able to offer to our students. But let me ask the two of you, are you concerned about the availability of loans for your students who do want to borrow to pay for part of their education?
From our vantage point in a small private institution, yes, we are concerned, but I've been assured by our Director of Financial Aid that because of our low default rate and other factors that we will have adequate funding there. But I've also been told that we won't know the impact of what's going on until we register our students this fall, and I think that's when you're going to see a response by presidents and other people, because the reality is going to set in at that point in time.
Dr. Padron?
Yeah, I happen to agree with that. I think we will know in a couple of months what the real impact is. We haven't felt it to a great degree, now, but I'm sure that it will happen. And so we're trying to prepare for it. I'm concerned about the students that Estela described as, above the line. Those middle-income students, what I call the working poor, and those are the students that are having the most difficulty because they don't qualify for the Pell Grants, but again, they have significant difficulties and they need the help, and we're trying to put most of our institutional help to assist those students. But it's not easy. The other group, the majority of the students that we have, cannot even think of loans. As a matter of fact, I advise them against it, because it will be almost committing suicide. So it's a real dilemma, and we're all facing it. You're absolutely right. It's an issue.
Thank you. Let me open it up now to members of the advisory committee to see if any of them have questions for our panelists. Judith?
I don't really have a question. I have more of a comment. In my day job, I do all the billing, loans, and collections for the University of Illinois system. And as I've said to most of my colleagues around the table, I think the perfect storm is October. We will send out bills to our students depending on your campus policy in August and September. When the students do not have adequate resources and that first set of bills go delinquent for 30 days, that's when this is all going to come out. And we continue to have this dialogue, but you're right, a lot of people are putting their blinders on and aren't seeing what is about to come. So I think that's why you're not hearing as much, but I think October is when the issue is going to come to head. So.
Dr. Giles?
I think I've got a number of questions that I had wanted to ask, but I think related to this, and I guess I'll pose part of this as a question to the group. We have a tendency to think about the student loan issues kind of as an all or nothing. Are loans going to be available to our students or not? But there's a sub-piece of this that we're seeing, and that I'd be interested in hearing whether others have given thought to that. And that's that as a result of the subprime credit crisis, the creditworthiness of families is deteriorating, notwithstanding what Congress has attempted to do. And I think that Mark Kantrowitz and others have estimated, have really described two things which we've seen in the industry. One, alternative loans have been repriced, so there will be increased costs to students and families. But maybe more importantly, the credit criteria have been adjusted so that those with lower credit qualifications will no longer be eligible for those loans if they were dependent on it. Perhaps more pertinent to many of us, though, is really the adverse credit issues associated with PLUS. And that's that some estimates are that we'll see an increase of upwards of 10% of families rejected from PLUS as a result of adverse credit. Some of those issues can be worked through by the individual lenders. It's fairly time consuming. But I've heard estimates that as many as 100,000 families may lose eligibility as a result of that, having already lost the ability to draw on home equity because home values have declined in regions and they no longer have any equity to draw on. So I'd be curious if folks are seeing any, what I would describe as the secondary credit impact on eligibility.
Let me just remind the audience members, if you have questions for the panelists, if you'd write them on your index cards, the committee staff will be coming around in a few minutes to collect those. Mr. Miller, you want to answer?
Again, this isn't a question. This is a question of things that are already happening. This isn't September. This is already happening to our students. You're absolutely right, Mr. Giles. Let me just give you one example. One of our schools had 1,000 students, online students, basically working adults, not poor students, that needed private loans on top of their federal loans and Pell eligibility and state grants that they packaged in December. They estimated that 25% of those would be rejected just based on subprime scores and what they knew. And that's sort of the typical trend line. And sure enough, that's what was rejected. 12 weeks later, their next class, 1,000 students, basically the same demographic, 45% were rejected. So the credit criteria had increased so much in that 12-week period from December to March that 20% more of those students who would have otherwise been packaged in December were not. Secondly, and that's just one example. I could give you many others. We're doing regular surveys at CCA every 7 or 8 weeks. Secondly, to your College Plus, while our student population tends to be older, so not as many are dependent, and therefore their parents aren't using College Plus, so my database is much smaller. Nevertheless, we are already seeing many situations, and it's not 10%. It's 20, 25, 30% more rejections, dramatic increases in rejections of PLUS loan applications. And what we're trying to figure out is some schools are reporting, and we're trying to figure this out, that even students in the direct loan College Plus program, their parents are being rejected because theoretically, in the direct loan program, as I understand it, and there are lawyers around the room and I'm not, there shouldn't be higher criteria than the basic criteria set out in the statute and the regulations, whereas if a school is working with a private lender, the private lender can set higher criteria. A bank or a non-bank lender could set higher criteria. So that you'd sort of say, okay, well, maybe they've set higher criteria, they're turning down more parents. But why in the DL program? That's what some of our financial aid people are scratching their heads about and trying to figure that out.
Mr. Jones, you had a question?
Yes. Kind of two questions. One first kind of directed to Dan and then to the panel. And maybe a comment first. At least in California, we get asked this question a lot, too, and I can only speak in terms of the lenders for the public institutions, the community colleges, and we're not yet sure about the proprietary or for-profit sector. Our students take out, just in our system, close to $1 billion of loans a year. Now, half of our schools are direct lenders and half of them are under the FELT program. So we're not sensing a credit squeeze yet for this fall. In fact, lenders have been sending letters to all of the institutions reminding them that we're there to serve. So maybe we're a bit more unique, but we are watching, I think, in the state the issue of proprietary institutions. The for-profit is a little bit different. But the question to Dan, and then another comment before Dan answers, and I'll just throw it open, is the extent to which the department can handle the volume if more and more schools were to move to direct lending. This is often a question and one that's surfacing. For those whose credit is being squeezed and availability may be restricted if they wanted to move into direct lending, what is the capacity of the federal government to manage that, and could they meet the demand? The second is just kind of thrown up to everybody, and then I'll release the microphone, is what, in terms of financing, we've talked about student loans, we've talked about the federal government through financial aids, universities and families. Is there a role for the private sector outside of student loans to help support education? I'm talking about businesses and corporations and other community organizations who are dependent upon the students who move through our systems to fill those gaps in the workforce that are very, very necessary. Is there a role there? We touched on it earlier in one of the remarks about public-private partnerships, but I wanted to address it a little bit more thoroughly. But Dan first.
Yeah, we're in a direct loan program. We're pretty comfortable that currently we could absorb about a doubling of our direct loan origination. We have to separate loan origination and loan servicing. Obviously, servicing comes sometime after origination. We could not double our servicing overnight, but then we'd never be in a circumstance where we'd have to. So again, on the origination side, we're comfortable that we can absorb, again, doubling the size of our originations. And then if whatever increase were to occur, if it does, then in terms of ensuring the necessary capacity, 6 months, a year, 3 years, graduate students, 10 years from now in terms of servicing, we could certainly build that up.
But would any of the panel members like to respond to Mr. Jones' question about the role of private sector organizations outside of loan providers in helping to address some of the current issues that students are facing? Yes.
I'll just comment on the question from the perspective of the public universities that I addressed before. In our research and discussions with these institutions, it's become apparent that there's an increasing disconnect between the governance of these institutions and the economic operations of these organizations. And we have written some research that the governance of public universities is essentially unchanged from the 1950s, whereas the economics have raced ahead and the public universities are, in many cases, now quasi-private or certainly heavily market-oriented. A big piece of a change that might be logical would be to have more of the people who pay for the education today on the boards of public universities. And those would be more student representatives, those would be more employer representatives, those would be two major groups. I think some of this is occurring informally. Public universities have appointed, in effect, auxiliary boards of advisors that often do have private employers there. But I think the topic is a fertile one, and I think it's probably something whose day has come where there would be a more direct role for private employers to be either on the boards or on auxiliary boards and participating from a governance and a financial perspective in the education of the students.
Others have comments on the roles of private sector organizations? Mr. Miller?
Well, if I understood Mr. Jones' question correctly, the short answer is, of course, career colleges exist to train people for the employer marketplace. So it's a constant iterative feedback. Almost all of my schools, I don't know about Ms. Fuller's school, but almost all of my schools have business advisory councils. They don't necessarily deal with them in terms of management or governance, but in terms of educational focus, training, programs, et cetera. That is their major source of ideas. It's not the faculty necessarily, although of course faculty input's important. It's not the students necessarily, though they want student input. But at the end of the day, it's a constant feedback loop with the employer community to make sure that the programs and offerings and the technology that go into the students' training and education reflect what the marketplace is expecting.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Jones.
The follow-up to that, I guess what I'm wondering as well, beyond just the management and that relationship, I was really thinking in terms of really direct financing in some way. We've seen Kaiser Permanente, for instance, in California, and Sharp Hospital in San Diego and other groups have come to us. We have about 17 campuses that offer nursing. Community colleges out of the 109, I don't remember how many, 70 or 80 of them offer nursing degrees to the RN. In order to address this capacity issue, which you're absolutely right, none of us are fully funded to expand our capacity, but they're providing direct assistance to institutions and scholarships to the students with the proviso that those students work X number of years, and at the end of that, if they don't, they convert to loans. Now, that creates some interesting dialogue we've been having in the state. But other industries are looking at similar types of things. If the only way we can ensure we have an adequate pool of well-qualified, educated students who can come into our particular market niche, they're starting to explore, and I don't know if this is good or bad and what your experience and what your thoughts are, but I kind of want to move us in that direction a little bit in terms of direct sponsorship of students or institutional programs above and beyond any state support or private support that a public or a private institution might receive.
It may be that when we get to the panel this afternoon where we start to talk about solutions, we might be able to generate some ideas there about what role the private sector can play in terms of financing in the ways that Mr. Jones has talked about. Let me turn to Dr. Presnell, who had a question.
Thank you, Don. John, I want to have you comment, if you would, on, from Moody's perspective and what you're seeing in the marketplace on a couple of issues. One in particular is, as we're talking about loans, just what's available out there in terms of capital resources, and what does the student loan paper look like? Is there an energy to continue to help support the funding for the student loan program, or is that in jeopardy? And the second is as well, so there we're looking at student loans and we're looking at individual student issues. If you back up as well and you take a look over to the other side, you start to see the bonding issue, and I'm concerned and interested in your comments as it relates to institutional debt service and what you see there and how that impacts individual campus resources, and again, where we are today and maybe what you might project in the future on those two issues, if you would.
Okay, thank you, Claude. Well, I think Brett has made some comments on the first point, but from our perspective on the student loan market, we would tend to think of it as two basic markets. One is the taxable securitization market, which has traditionally been dependent on, among other things, the commercial paper, asset-backed commercial paper rates. And then there's the auction rate market for the tax exempts. And we're not seeing a lot of improvement in either. The auction rate market is, in the tax exempt market, is comprised of two basic types of borrowers, and those would be the student lenders and general municipal borrowers. The general municipal borrowers have seen a lot of improvement in their rates. Their auction rates are much lower. On the student lender side, what we're seeing is a little bit of improvement, but not really dramatic improvement. And it goes to, I think, the point that Brett was making earlier about the market's general reaction to this asset class, despite the fact that there's very little credit concern in the underlying asset. Will this change? I think probably Brett is a little more closer to what his views would be on that topic, but we're not seeing that improve dramatically from certainly the securitization perspective. As far as the debt of the institutions go, we are watching it very closely. It is a concern of ours, and one of the things I would ask the panel to keep in mind is to avoid generalizations and to think about sort of segmenting the market. So the larger organizations, the traditional organizations, are the favored institutions by lenders, and that's because they have economies of scale, they have low default rates, and if you remove some of the subsidy from the lenders, which was done in the Congressional Act, then those that are in the game are going to focus on the most lucrative, highest economy of scale, lowest cost of servicing type aspect of the market, and that's going to be the largest institutions with the lowest default rates, where the students also tend to take out larger loans. The institutions that will not be favored in this market will be smaller institutions where they have a less predictable loan flow and where the students tend to take out smaller loans. Those are actually costlier on a per capita, per loan basis for the lenders to service. So we are frankly quite concerned that some smaller organizations, and Harris, I'm addressing the not-for-profit private sector, not your membership, but we are quite concerned, as are some of these institutions, that their students are not going to have access to loans at anywhere near the rates that they're used to. And a possible conclusion of all this is that these institutions are going to actually have to lend the students money in order to attend this fall. And if you think of the comparison of hospitals, one of their core competencies from a management perspective is getting paid after the fact, revenue cycling, managing receivables. That's not something that colleges are good at. That's not something that colleges have ever had an experience with. They have a different business model where you essentially get paid up front, or you get paid in an agreed over time, but it's an agreement over time that you get paid. It's not something where you provide the service and effectively lend credit to the patient or the student and then try to get the money afterwards. But that is something that some colleges are now beginning to prepare for, so they may actually have to take out cash flow borrowing this fall to fund their students, and that is certainly a credit concern.
A number of the committee members have questions, and we're going to try to get to all of them jumping around. This is not like a congressional hearing where every member gets 5 minutes and we go strictly in order of seniority going back and forth across the aisle, so we'll try to get to everybody. Mr. Cotton and then Ms. Fuller had a question.
I remember many years ago I was writing a story for the Wall Street Journal, and I was interviewing a distinguished economist. And he looked at me, I was quite young, he looked at me, he says, "Young man, you don't know the first law of economics." And I said, "What is the first law of economics?" About is that we will make massive curricular changes in order to assure that our students will have employable skills when they leave, and that would distress me very greatly. Is that the proliferation of bachelor degrees in near professional activities has been so rapid in American higher education, it makes the fecundity of rabbits look sick. There is almost nothing that I should back up. I say that we must not allow ourselves to be bullied by this financial problem we've got, and it's a severe one on many levels, into so changing American education that it loses its ultimate value and worth.
Thank you. Ms. Fuller? Let her ask her question, then we can get back.
Thank you. Just a few observations and then a question. Default rates certainly have played a key role in financing of higher education, and I wouldn't want anyone to walk away feeling that just because you have a low default rate at your institution that you are going to be saved from having lender access, because many low default rate institutions have found their lender lists dwindling. Sheer volume is taken into consideration and a lot of other aspects. I understand the banks through a credit. It's a business decision that they have to look at the bottom line, and if they're not making a profit, they can't afford, especially in this climate, to be making loans to unprofitable institutions, and they're just going to focus on the institutions where there is really no risk at all involved to them. Our country is a country that operates on credit, and financial literacy is really not out there for our students. Students take on loans that they don't understand that they're borrowing. They see an advertisement on television and it's like quick and easy, and they've got that tuition statement that's due, and they go online and get an alternative loan. It's like putting your education on your credit card. The onus is on us to educate them, to let them know that there are choices. But I feel like our choices are being diminished. And I think that students going to our kinds of institutions, as Harris has pointed out, we may be feeling this before everyone else. Some of the families in the traditional schools, they haven't had credit checks run yet. And our problem in this country, the economic situation, for instance, in California, the housing market in Riverside and San Diego, huge problems there. When those families have their credit run, there's going to be a problem there for that student, whether they're going to a 2-year college, a 4-year state university, or a private institution. There's going to be a problem there. I've thought about this problem quite a bit over the last several months, actually. And with the lenders leaving the program, I feel like we're starting to build a 2-tiered system here, where you're going to have FFEL lenders for the more traditional college setup. And I do believe our students should have choices. Those subsidies that the lenders had, perhaps that did allow them to have an equal playing field for students going to 2-year colleges, shorter term institutions, and maybe even absorb some of those institutions that have high default rates. There's less reliance, as we've heard from our testimony today, on the state subsidies, federal subsidies. We need the private sector. We need the private sector involved in this. I guess I would like to just end by asking Mr. Nelson if he could comment. We talked a little bit about liquidity, but H.R. 5715 was a piece of legislation which flew through the Congress, and is that going to provide additional liquidity? Is it working thus far, or what does it need to do?
Noreen, I wish I had an answer for you on that, because I don't know the answer. It's our read on the impact of that is going to be coming directly from the colleges themselves, because that's our client base, where the real impact is going to be felt by the parents first, and we don't have a window into the. I would just say that that we've all stressed that there are multiple factors that are causing these events to happen, and the peak lending season for most traditional schools is just beginning, and we probably won't know. We won't have any greater insight into that probably for a couple of months.
Mr. Lee, if you wanted to weigh in on this.
Thank you. We believe that 5715, which was a rare showing of bipartisanship in a very rapid manner by the Congress, did indicate that the Congress saw that there was difficulty for loans after July 1st of this year. We have been working steadfastly with the Department of Education on 3 plans. One is an option where lenders can sell their loans to the federal government. One is where the Secretary of Education and Treasury invest in a pool of funds where lenders can take money from and pay it back at a reasonably fair rate, or at least we've been told that. And then the third is a national lender of last resort program, which would provide direct government funds to organizations called guarantee agencies who would lend it, and then those loans would be assigned to the Secretary immediately upon disbursement. We have been moving pretty rapidly. However, we've sort of hit a speed bump. And the speed bump has been that we're looking for the terms and conditions under which these funds will be made available in a more final form. So while there have been some lenders, national lenders, that have indicated that they will lend to all students at all schools, there are a substantially larger number of lenders who cannot make that commitment because of the financial markets, because of the risk, because of something in that law which, again, always ruins good things in Washington, and it's called cost neutrality, and the fact that the government has been unable to determine whether or not the plan that they have announced on May 21st is cost neutral or not, and we're waiting for the term sheet, which we had hoped to receive the middle toward the end of last week, and we're not necessarily certain when we're going to get it. So while we have all the respect for the department and we're working with them, we don't have enough information yet to determine whether or not this plan will work. There was also a provision of that bill that I think would have pretty much ended the liquidity difficulty. However, in the era of cost containment, there was a policy decision made which indicated that loans made only after May 1st of 2008 for a period of 1 year would be eligible for this assistance, even though the legislation provided the authority to go backwards a number of years. So those bond issuances that are out there that have been failing would be able to be sold to the department or would be able to be put to the department. There could be a forward purchase agreement. And in that regard, we would be able to pay off the current bondholders. Many of them now are receiving zero interest, although many of them have done quite well over the past couple of years. And it would have put the backstop that I think would have helped the market, Mr. Nelson, in the fact that it would have put confidence back in there that the government is standing behind these loan instruments. And the fact that the government is doing it means that new investors can enter into it. We are in an incredible period of time right now where the repayment rate on student loans, according to the government calculation, is in excess of 96.4%, 95.4%. That's incredible when you consider the type of students that are borrowing billions of dollars each year. It takes a lot of money to prevent a default. And what we want to do is to see the terms. We would like to see it expanded to help those bondholders so they can reinvest in new issues. And then pretty much I think you will see every lender lending at every institution. Right now what they're doing, Noreen, is they're hedging their bets. There's uncertainty as to whether or not they will have the relief that is provided for in H.R. 5715.
Thank you. Let me, Stella, did you want to respond to that?
I'd like to make sure and leave the committee with going back to the individual student and family perspective, which is this loan discussion is extremely important, but it's also extremely complex. And we have a high percentage of low-income students and immigrant families in particular who are never even inducted into the U.S. loan market, whether it's student or housing. So we can't forget those groups. In particular, also what I would urge the committee to explore is the relationship between home ownership and college access. So, for example, some recent research I've conducted with Bridget Terry Long looked at whether there was a positive association between home ownership and college access, and early results tell us that there is, which is why then this new middle-income group that's so vulnerable under this current economic crisis is particularly important right now. But bringing back the discussion to not only students who are never inducted into the loan process, but students from families who are not homeowners and also have bad credit, and think of the double burden that those families are facing.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. So let me go to Dr. Giles, and then we're going to go to Mr. Russo, and then we've got a number of questions that the audience members have posed here, so I'm going to try to get some of those also. Okay, let me go to Dr. Giles.
I think that as tempting as it is for me to delve deeper into some of the specific loan issues, because that's all that's consumed my time for a while, I want to step back and ask a question, a broader question that I think relates to the initial capacity discussion that we discussed before, both in terms of seats and in terms of financing. And Renee and I found each other sitting next to each other, and we realized that we actually represent the New England contingent. And part of what I'm wondering is if as we discuss this, whether or not there are really some regional differences here that are relevant to this conversation, because I think that the capacity question in terms of seats looks very different in Florida and California than it does in the New England region, where we're actually losing population, at least college-age population. And the second part of this, I think, which is also regional, that I think bears mentioning, is that I think that this access to finance question also has regional elements to it. Those regions that are served by nonprofits have a different set of considerations, and within our state we've been fortunate enough to be able to secure some financing, although I will say we've only been able to do that as a result of being able to draw upon equity that we'd built up in the past. The loans, it's not that they don't make a profit, it's that they don't cover their costs in this current environment. But on a regional basis, I think that certain institutions have made commitments to all sectors of higher education. And I think Renee and I each come from a region where that's been the case. So I'd be curious as to what people think the significance of this regional component to this is. We've got schools clearly in Vermont and New Hampshire that would love to welcome students from California and Florida if we could figure out how to convince them that 16 degrees below zero is really a good time.
Anybody have a response to the issue of convincing students to be able to take advantage of excess capacity when perhaps the weather's not exactly what they're looking for, but there are fine institutions up there in Vermont and New Hampshire?
My thought would be that the cost. I mean, if they can go to New Hampshire and Vermont for the in-state rate, they could probably do it. But when they're paying exorbitant out-of-state rates, it puts it out of reach. So I think that's, we can say, come and get an education, but can they do it at the in-state rate? And that's what I know a lot of the large publics are grappling with.
Their financial aid package will include a parka for every student coming from California or Florida and skis. Comments? Mr. Miller?
Well, clearly the career college sector is expanding primarily in fast-growing areas where there are job opportunities, again, by definition. I mean, historically there have been more obstacles to having career colleges in some of the northeastern states because the higher education regulators tended to be much more skeptical. But in states where there is a implicit, if not explicit, compact between the business community, the economic development people, and higher education, we have found that those states are very welcoming. We've had a big expansion here in Tennessee. Dr. Rhoda, I know, has been very involved with that. Florida, California, Arizona, Virginia, because there are lots of jobs coming, lots of opportunities. The employer community looks to the traditional higher education system, asks questions whether that can produce enough students. And if they can't, then they're very welcoming to the career college sector, which does have the capital to at least create the seats. It may not have the capital to fund the students because they exist entirely on tuition, but they do have the capacity to create the seats. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of career colleges opening in New Hampshire or Vermont, even if somehow global warming turned them into livable places.
Let me turn to Mr. Russo, and then we're going to try to get to some of the topics that the audience members were asking about.
We've heard a number of comments expressing concern for students, certain students who may not have as much access to loans as a result of the current conditions, and also to certain institutions whose students might not. We've also heard less concern about, let us say, more traditional students whose access to these loans appears at this point, although we haven't really started processing, they will have ability to secure these loans. But for the record, I think it would be important to note that borrowers, even those who will be able to secure loans, as we've heard already, there may be some plus loan denials because of increased credit. But there may be some cash flow processing issues. We don't know. There are going to be some new lenders or some lenders whose capacity is going to be stretched that might generate or result in cash flow issues to institutions and to students to pay rent and so forth. There may also be there are going to be, there's no question, lost payment of fees up front, that lenders whose margins are now dramatically reduced will no longer be able to do that. So students, when they register to pay their bills in the fall, will have a balance that had not necessarily always been there because of the generosity of the lenders. When it comes to a yet to happen time for payment, there may also be a considerable lost benefits. And these losses of fees and benefits could amount to thousands of dollars for the borrowers, even those who will be able to obtain these loans. And finally, with the new paradigm that we have for lenders being able, if they want to sell their loans to the government, if they've already been engaged for a couple of years with one lender and will now be moving to another servicer, there may indeed be some servicing issues which could result in increased defaults. So those are issues of concern for those who may be able to secure loans. So whether there's a crisis or not, I'm not sure, and maybe not all the votes are in yet. I don't know if Brent would have any reaction to any of that.
Just one point, Joe. I think if you want to have a good loan program in this nation, you need to have it founded on a fantastic grant program so that you limit the borrowing that students need and you limit the borrowing to students who have a better ability to pay. And until there are sufficient state scholarship and grants and a strong Pell Grant that can go further, you're never going to have a good student loan program because individuals who should not borrow are being forced to borrow. And it comes down to the foundation of which student aid is currently built is tippy.
Thank you. Dr. Lenth?
I was looking for an opportunity to make a similar point, in part because while I don't agree with all the discussions around the issues, the current issues around student lending, I heard you say earlier, well, let's start with the premise that we have to not continue to let politics dominate good policy and get back to some basic decisions. My sort of ending comment as you go to the audience would be to ask ourselves whether we're really serving that goal well enough when we address the issues specifically and try to deal with particular problems rather than the more underlying issues, whether as we began we define those in terms of overall capacity and funding capacity, or, Mr. Cotton, in terms of the quality of what we're doing. At least I think from my point of view, there's been at least a quiet revolution in some of our thinking over the last 15 years, and I think what we need to do is get that more effectively into policy debates at some point.
Thank you. Let me turn to some of the questions that have been raised by the audience members. The first question is, are the Red Sox going to win the World Series again this year? The advisory committee staff were supposed to screen these questions. I'm sorry. Now, that's my New England bias coming out there. No, the first question is an audience member would like to hear more of a discussion about need-based versus merit-based aid. The background is that, for example, at the state level, if you go back 15 years, about 10% of all state grants were awarded without considering financial need. It's now up to almost 30%. 10 years ago, the majority of institutional grants to undergraduates were need-based. Now the majority of institutional grants by far are merit-based grants without considering need. Even the federal government now with the ACG and SMART grants have now introduced a merit component to add-ons to the Pell Grant. So there's been quite a shift in recent years from an emphasis on need in the awarding of grants to more merit criteria. What are the implications for this shift in funding of students, particularly needy students who are very reliant on grants, as we've just talked about? Turn first to our two college presidents, both of whom are in states that have significant merit-based grant programs. And Dr. Padron talked a little bit about the Bright Futures and the impact it's had, but in general, in other ways, how is this impacting your students in either Tennessee or Florida?
Well, as I said, in Florida it has a major impact because when you have only 22% of all the financial aid programs being provided on need basis, where the greatest need is, you have a problem. And the Bright Futures, which, by the way, all college presidents, everyone have lobbied against it for now well over 5 years, and it's taking a big chunk of the legislative appropriation every year. Was supposed to be paid through the lottery funds, but that's not even enough right now to cover the cost of so it's taxpayers' money that is going into supporting this program. And as I said, it's going to families that could very well pay for the cost. So while you have many students who just are not attending or are struggling because they don't have the resources. So the impact is major, and it's an issue of politics versus good policy, and we have not succeeded in changing that around. It impacts students at all levels, and you take a year like this, for example, at my institution, where the state is facing a shortfall in revenues of a couple of billions of dollars. The allocations to the colleges have been significantly reduced. We had to, for this year, we're having 8% reduction in our state allocation for an institution that is already severely underfunded, where we get 1/3 of what the universities get for the same student. Is already a strained situation, and we have been forced to basically, being an open door institution, we have been forced to reduce the number of class sections that we offer by well over 1,000. And the impact on that is an increase in class size, and it also impacts the ability of students to take the courses they need to progress or to graduate. So the ripple effect is major. It's all combined. You know, you cannot separate them. And I frankly still hope that we can change that around, but in the foreseeable future, I don't see how.
Dr. Moody, can you talk a little bit about the challenges that your institution faces in deciding between allocating financial aid resources to need-based aid versus merit-based aid?
Well, probably as every other institution, we have a financial aid matrix that deals more with the, I guess...
Excuse me, can you pull your mic a little bit closer to you because I'm not sure we're picking you up. Thank you.
Probably as many other institutions, we have a financial aid matrix that we use that awards, that we can actually focus where the student, the type of student that we want to recruit more heavily or resource more heavily. Unfortunately, that does not take into consideration their financial need. We do, at least at our institution, try to allocate many of our resources, though, on a need basis. As you might imagine, we have many students who are on Pell Grants and that sort of thing. We also, in the state of Tennessee, have funding through the lottery program, and thankfully the private and the public schools were funded at the same level, thanks to the hard work of the Tennessee Independent Colleges and Universities Association. It is a problem, and the ones who are the neediest and the ones who are most likely to exit out of the system are those who have the financial need, obviously. And then when they do exit out, if they don't graduate, it's more of a financial burden on them than it is on those who obviously pass and are gainfully employed, etc.
Dr. Flores and then Dr. Lenth.
Sure. This is a critical question, especially with expanding demographics in certain regions of the country. The research has consistently showed that low-income and racial minorities are the groups least likely to benefit from merit aid. Where these merit aid programs are located is particularly important, as they're located primarily in the South, not only, but the changing demographics of the South signals, and various reports have noted this as well, that Hispanic high school graduates are going to comprise the largest growth of all high school graduates in every state in the nation except Hawaii. So a group that is particularly not likely to benefit from merit aid are English language learners. So looking at who benefits, who loses, and expanding the group beyond race, I think, is something to think about.
Thank you. Dr. Lenth?
But not related to what you're talking about in states like Florida with a major commitment to merit-based. But in general, looking over the states, first sort of caution, how do we think about, for example, a program that provides some degree of assistance to...
Can you make sure you're holding your button down because you're fading in and out? It might be a little closer to the mic. Will help. Thanks.
All right. An award to an individual seeking any type of degree, from a certificate up through a baccalaureate degree, the criteria for which are a 2.5 GPA average graduating from high school, and the only other criteria being no felony convictions. Is that a merit-based program? Or a program in another state, and another real example, providing an award to the top number of GED certificate achievers during the year. based. In fact, they're targeted at specific population groups and need to be recognized as such. And that leads to the hopeful point. It seems to be one area where there has been some conversation over the last decade about how we need to link financial aid, need-based financial aid, to academic preparation and build some linkages there so that we provide students through an early commitment program or some other mechanism some assurance that they will be able to afford to go on to post-secondary education of their choosing if they follow through and perform with it under certain criteria in high school. And that's an area where states are making some progress, trying to put some new programs into place, and I think it should be supported in every way we can.
Dr. Presnell, you have a comment?
I think this is a really critical issue, Dr. Flores. Your observation has played out here in the state of Tennessee. When you take a look at the lottery scholarship program versus the need-based aid program here in the state, and fortunately in Tennessee we have both at this point, but minority populations are grossly underrepresented in the merit-based program. They're very much overrepresented in the need-based aid program. The lottery scholarship program, and you've got to deal with not only you got to deal, and you want to be able to put forth some really good public policy in terms of college access, but politicians are also dealing with the political reality of what it would take to get a program passed. In the state of Tennessee, it took a constitutional amendment in order to even enact a lottery, and when they did that, they attached to it the language of how those lottery revenues would be passed. That was a benefit to the higher education community in the sense that it was going to focus on scholarship programs. Nevertheless, it went merit. Two things, though, that were very positive in that is that they added a need-based supplement to the lottery scholarship. So if students did qualify for the merit component and had incomes below $36,000, they got an additional $1,500 on top of what is now $4,000. They get a $5,500 grant. That's good. The other thing that has worked well and has shifted the discussion in the state is that we required the FAFSA in order to qualify for the lottery scholarship. We needed that information that served as the application for it. As a result, the number of Pell-eligible students increased precipitously. In other words, low-income families who were going to college were not filling out the FAFSA at the level they should have been. Well, once you say, well, you want to be eligible for the lottery scholarship, you fill out the FAFSA, all of a sudden, boom, went up. So then it exacerbated a problem. We found out our need-based aid program was not even close to keeping pace with the need of the students in the state. So it has changed. The changes in the lottery scholarship program are starting to slow down because available revenue are not there. The legislature is starting to pay close attention to what we need to do with the need-based aid program. And, if I had my druthers, we'd put the $250 million a year of the lottery program into need-based aid, and we'd take the $52 million a year we put in need-based aid and put it into a merit program. Well, it just doesn't work here. Again, we have political reality. So it's a combination of all these things coming together. But I'm encouraged, at least in this state, that the conversation is starting to move back over to what should we do over here. As a matter of fact, they entertained, and the governor had as a part of his platform, to take some of the excess money out of the lottery scholarship program because of the implementation, take $200 million and use that as an endowment for the need-based aid program. That didn't pass, but they did pass the commitment of an additional $10 million a year to the need-based aid program. So the conversation is slightly shifting a little bit. And so I see some encouragement there, but then it goes back to scarce resources. Public institutions were cut by $55 million this year, even though we still got a $10 million boost in need-based aid. Until the state can increase its commitment to higher education, period, we're not going to see the progress in those areas that we need. So thanks for letting me have a little soapbox.
Before I get to Mr. Miller, I want to echo something that Dr. Presnell said. To my knowledge, Tennessee is the only state that has a traditional merit aid program like this that recognized that financially needy students need some additional assistance there, and they're the only ones that have this supplement that I think is now $1,500. They give an extra $1,500 to students who are below $36,000 a year in family income, and I do a lot of work with states on these kinds of programs, and that's one of the things I always point to, that in its wisdom, Tennessee did recognize that some students need a little bit of additional assistance, so that if they do qualify for this program, they do get a little bit more help, and I think that's a good trend that other states might want to look at. Mr. Miller?
Just three quick observations, none of which is going to make me very popular. Number one, I think we're all dancing around the import of the question and the import of the data that Dr. Heller threw out at the beginning of the answer. It's all about prestige. People are going that way. That's why the trend line is toward more merit-based than need-based. If schools want to give up the focus on prestige, they'll start going back to merit-based. If they don't, they're going to continue to need-based. If they're not, they're going to continue on merit-based. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, but let's be honest about what's going on. Another aspect of that is last year Congress gave $2.5 billion of earmarks to higher education institutions in this country. That's great. My alma maters both got some. That's wonderful. But $2.5 billion, if you'd taken that toward Pell Grant, that would have raised Pell Grants by about $700 this year, and it would have been $5,400 maximum Pell Grant instead of $4,700. So again, it's kind of trade-offs about what kind of things we want to do. And thirdly, to take a slap at my friends in the lending community, they're not being very creative. I mean, we know, for example, from all kind of research, I haven't read Dr. Flores' research, I assume if she's done it, this would bear this out, that the first year is critical in terms of whether students are going to make it or not, and whether they're going to make it or not depends on whether they're going to repay their loans. So instead of just taking a whole blanket policy and wiping out a whole group of students or schools, why don't they get more creative and say, well, maybe we won't lend to students their first year, particularly if they're going to community colleges or career colleges or schools with higher default rates. But if they get through the first year, you know, they're pretty good bets at completing their program, whether it's 2 years or 4 years, and they're pretty good risk of paying back their loans. So let's be a little creative here. I think these are the kind of things we need to start thinking through. I understand from a business point of view, as Ms. Flores said before, the banks may say, well, I don't want to lend to a first-year student going to a 2-year program with a high default rate and low income. But maybe we ought to be a little more creative. I think there are things we can do without having to wait for the markets to totally recover to the point where they were a year ago, where borrowers could go out and get money in the commercial marketplace for commercial rates plus 40 basis points. I'm not sure that's coming back anytime soon.
Ms. Flink, do you want to address this issue?
Just to let you know, there are, in Illinois and in a couple other states, there's additional programs now created just for seniors, and it's addressing just what you're saying. Seniors are very low risk, so there's loan programs at excellent rates being created for those students, and they're able to do it because they are low risk. So you're starting to see some of those discussions happen, then things come out in the market space.
Let me get to another question from an audience member to get to another topic. The question is, to what extent will to what extent will colleges be affected by changes or decreases in charitable giving? Clearly many institutions, and it used to be largely private institutions, but today we see public universities engaging in multi-billion-dollar fundraising campaigns. So, and even community colleges, who years ago didn't think too much about fundraising. Now we see community colleges in the business of trying to raise funds. So, given the economic circumstances and the potential for any changes in the law in Washington or in states, how are institutions likely to be affected by changes or, most importantly, decreases in charitable giving? Dr. Padron?
We're seeing the impact of that already. In Florida, we have a program called the Benjamin Program that matches dollar per dollar donors' contributions to institutions. And this year, for the first time in a long time, no monies were appropriated for this. So the incentive for donors to say, for every dollar you give us, we're going to have another dollar, is not there. But overall, because of the economy, we're seeing in our fundraising efforts, a decrease in interest and a decrease in donors' abilities to support. So that's going to probably this year is going to become even more relevant.
Just out of curiosity, and let me ask you, as a community college president, how much of your efforts and your time do you spend on fundraising?
It increases every day. It's a significant amount of time. I would say no less than 40% of my time at this time. And we're, of course, engaged in a major fundraising effort right now, so it's taking more time than usual.
Do you have a campaign goal you want to share with us?
Yes, we have a campaign going, and it's time-consuming for everybody at the institution.
Dr. Moody?
Well, certainly raising funds for the institution, it's almost 100% of one's time, because in any relationship that you form or anything you do, whether it's the marketing of the institution or anything, it's all about either trying to attract students or try to attract friends of the university, develop friends and donors. I guess in terms of fundraising in the private sector, I would just say that there are some people who are not going to be largely impacted by all of this, and they will continue to give, maybe not at the levels they have in the past, but many people are not impacted. Also, in 2006, individuals accounted for 75% of the charitable giving in this country, and 65% of all households with incomes of below $100,000 contributed and made charitable gifts to institutions. I think that will change in this climate that we're in. So, yes, I think that charitable giving will be impacted. I'm envious of the institutions that have large endowments and have made announcements, as Vanderbilt, I believe, did today for 2009, that need-based aid will be covered through other mechanisms. That's not an option for schools with much smaller endowments.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that. There's been a lot of publicity around the kind of programs announced by Vanderbilt and other institutions that have significant endowments and been able to make those commitments to students from families with more moderate incomes. Is this good or bad for the 16 million higher education students in this country? Does that perhaps make policymakers or the public believe that we've solved this problem because all institutions are now doing this, or does it perhaps make it more apparent to people that this is an issue that other institutions need to address? What do you believe about that? Mr. Nelson?
Well, looking at the distribution of enrollment of students, the institutions that can afford to take steps like that enroll a tiny share of the students, less than 1%. So while it's those organizations also happen to be the market leaders in many ways in the industry, and so it's a very important step, but it's not going to directly affect many students. In fact, a lot of institutions who are not in the very top tier of organizations are in fact quite worried by this step, because it's putting a lot of economic pressure on them to do something, and as Harris said, it's a reputation-driven business. They feel compelled to follow suit in some public way, but they don't have the financial resources to do so. I would just like to circle back to the question on philanthropy. I think the impact of the current situation is going to be extremely diverse, and it depends on where you are. Certainly if you're in an oil-producing state, I don't think you're really suffering from a decline in philanthropy at the moment. In fact, you're probably doing very well. And ironically, the wealthiest institutions generally raise the vast majority of their funds from a very small number of donors and very large gifts. And that will probably continue. I will say that those who are dependent on the financial industry as a source of large gifts might actually suffer in this current environment. But the biggest impact is likely to be on institutions that are new to the game of fundraising, because it typically takes several decades at least to develop a real network of donors, and those that are younger institutions or have not developed that yet, I think are going to be hurt in this environment.
Mr. Cotton?
An aspect of this that we haven't yet discussed, and we've talked about the impact of the tuition competition. Yale began to change the mix last week when it announced that it would increase its undergraduate student body by 20%. The first increase in Yale's undergraduate body, I believe, in 40 years. The last one was when they decided to admit women to the hallowed precincts of Yale. This will change the complexion of the competition at that level will be affected because other institutions will react to this. Because one of their definitions, obviously for 18 years, I worked with colleges and universities in New England, which Scott knows and Renee knows. I have a rule which is that the driving forces of higher education are snobbery and envy. But the impact of the competition, lessening that competition, if they begin to increase their capacity, because they have defined quality largely on the basis of freezing capacity. They have simply not increased enrollment since the late 70s, if not a little before then. That's going to change the psychology of the competition for students in high school. It's going to change. I think it will change a lot of things, and it's nice to have New Haven lead.
Another question is about academic preparation. We've touched on this very briefly, that certainly when we're talking about access to higher education, academic preparation plays a critical role. And while it's not necessarily just a factor of finances, it's certainly something that is, I know, something every institution, every admissions office deals with. Even in an open enrollment institution, there are concerns about academic preparation in order to cut down the amount of remediation that incoming students have to face. Are there particular challenges that, from an institutional perspective, or from a state perspective, or from the perspective of students around academic preparation that we should be concerned about in today's economy, in today's situation?
75% of my incoming freshmen from high school test deficient in at least one basic skill. And the amount of resources that we have to set aside to help them overcome deficiencies so they can join the mainstream of academic life, it is substantial. I personally happen to feel that that's the most important thing we do, because if we were to reject those students and not give them a chance, we would be creating an incredibly negative situation in our community, in the state, and the nation. So it's important, but nevertheless, it puts a tremendous burden on us in terms of the resources of the institution, and it is something that creates difficulties in more ways than one. And it's not just the developmental programs that have to be created for the students. These students are very fragile and bring with them all kind of issues and problems and self-concept and self-esteem issues and things like that. So it's not just the cost of the instruction, but it's the cost of the support systems that have to be put in place, tutors, labs, etc., to help them succeed. And it is an issue that is a reflection of the problems we're having in our K through 12 system throughout the nation. But thank God that there are community colleges that are willing to take this challenge, because the many or most of the universities, I would say, are doing the opposite, are becoming more restrictive, more selective, and the students would never have a chance.
Mr. Russo?
I think the need for remediation, I think is not restricted to students who attend community colleges. I think I've read that perhaps 40% of the students in four-year institutions need at least one remedial course. We talk about the cost of education. There are a lot of reasons why students don't finish on time in 4 years. This is one. If you're going to need a 1 or 2 or 3 remedial courses, you're going to be backed up. So someone is going to pay for a 9th semester, parent, student, borrowing. If you're in a public institution, the taxpayer is still paying for that additional cost for that extra semester. You, the student, are still in school. You're not out working. That's lost opportunity cost. And some student may not be able to come because you're still there. You talk about the cost. This is one that really needs to be addressed. And there are a lot of reasons why students don't finish on time. The need for remediation is one.
Dr. Giles, you have a comment?
I guess two observations about this, and I think that this may be in part one of the most important policy questions that we touch on, and in a sense it's almost unfortunate that we're touching upon it primarily in the context of issues related to cost and financial aid. We're at a point in this country, whether we want to fully acknowledge the consequences of it or not, that I think is similar to what we as a country faced at the transition from the 19th to 20th century, when we decided that compulsory K through 12 education, or K through 8 in some places, was a social good that needed to be supported. Students, of this generation, I mean, the reality in all of our regions, but I can use Vermont statistics, are that 80% of the job opportunities that exist in the future require some form of education after high school. Now, that may be a certificate program, it may be an associate's degree, it may be something, but 80% of the job opportunities. When I take a look at the ones that are disappearing, 80% of the ones disappearing are those that require a high school diploma or less. So that I think that the challenge that we face from an access perspective is that virtually every student will require something after high school, and we have to find a way to be able to deliver that to them in an affordable fashion. And I think that one of the things that's unfortunate about the focus on remedial is we tend to think of it in terms of cost and lose sight of the fact that if we do not educate these students, and this is without even speaking to the adults that are already in the workforce that we need to be able to speak to, if we do not find a way to educate them, we lose something vast as a society. And I think the second observation I wanted to make is, I think, another conundrum. It's not that we don't know how to do this. The participants in my talent search and my Gear Up programs, first-generation students, have a 90% continuation rate. I can serve 18 to 19% of the eligible students in the state.
Thank you. Mr. Miller?
The Career College Association school population has the same kind of challenges that Dr. Padron mentioned and Mr. Russo mentioned. I just wanted to remark that what I've been impressed by visiting our schools is their attempt to integrate the remediation into the content of the program. Think of the old model, and I don't know about traditional education as much, but the old model used to be if you're deficient in an area, you take a course in that area, whether it's math or English or writing, and then you get into your more substantive career education. More and more schools are moving away from that so that the student doesn't feel that that becomes a hurdle or an obstacle to education. And they're taking it simultaneously or it's integrated into the introductory courses, and they seem to feel that that's much more successful. Again, I don't know whether there's any research in that, Dr. Flores or others, but and I'm not sure we even have research. This is just experiential. It seems to work better.
Mr. Jones.
Two comments. Just a quick note on the remediation. When we talk about remediation, it's always helpful if we define what we mean by it. So I would urge us to try to do that. In California State University, we have remediation, about half of our first-time freshmen, but remediation is if you don't achieve 550 on the SAT. And that's a very high standard. So these students are not remedial in a traditional sense, so we need to be careful. But what gives rise in the conversation that I wanted to just to ask, so much of the comments, it seems to me, have really focused, although not necessarily directly, but to the more traditional first-time freshmen. And there's a whole population of students, the transfers, that I hope we factor into our discussion. Again, by way of example, in California, we have a community college system with over 2 million students. The California State University enrolls 75% of those each year. But what you're looking at in terms of your transfers are older adults. They have other competing responsibilities. They have other financing issues. We talked about the regionalization earlier, Scott. At least in our state, we find, in other studies we've seen, when you get to that age of 23, 24 with the other responsibilities that they've established, over about 80% to 85% of our California community college students actually transfer to a four-year institution within a 10, 15, 20-mile radius, or whatever is a reasonable commuting time. It doesn't go by mileage in our state, but it goes by minutes to get there. So there is another whole layer here at some point we need to address, because I think the financial needs and the financial pressures experienced by transfer population are significantly different in many instances. And again, we don't recognize them fully in the process, nor do we go out and as actively try to find ways to mitigate some of those expenses for those students. So it's my observation in this conversation is if we can broaden it, if not in our remaining time this morning, but certainly as we talk about solutions maybe this afternoon.
Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes left. Let me throw out one concluding question that I hope some of you can respond to. Depending upon who you listen to, this country is either in a recession now, some people call an economic downturn, but clearly there are constraints on resources, both private and public resources, that affect higher education institutions. We're facing large increases in commodity prices that affect students, whether they're paying for gas or food, or institutions who have to use energy to operate their physical plants. From your perspective and from what you understand, is this something that's just typical of an economic downturn we've faced in the past, and we just have to wait it out for a short period of time and things will be rosy again, and when things pick up we'll see state funding, for example, rebound as it has in the past? Or is in fact the situation we're in now different from prior economic downturns, and we need to adjust our expectations for what the rebound will look like whenever it does happen? Mr. Nelson?
I think there's always a tendency to think that the current times you're going through are different from the past. But with that said, I do think there are very material differences between this and previous downturns. And in terms of higher education access, one of the differences is that the country has been experimenting with de facto privatization of public higher education now for several decades. So these organizations are now changed probably permanently in their behavior and their funding organization, and that has significant impacts on the cost. The other material difference I would see is that the globalization of financial markets and the downturn of financial markets is playing a much bigger role in this current downturn than previous downturns.
Thank you. Others? Dr. Lenth?
Is that on now? 2 quick points on the effects of recessions. Obviously, there are direct effects on funding for higher education, but as we look across the states, at least at the current time, it's quite variable, and the other variant in that is the political climate. So there are states that are not necessarily doing better economically, but are budgeting more for higher education because they're trying to recover from a period of years in which they now recognize they were severely underfunding their higher education systems. So there's a little bit less of a uniform pattern in the response, or direct pattern in the response in the funding of higher education. The other part of that is the effect on enrollments. After the recession in 2001, 2002, nationally at least, we experienced for a period of 3 to 4 years very steep increases in overall enrollment levels, which may well be an effect of a lack of employment opportunities also. There were clearly some demographic changes that came into play there, but I think the historic patterns are something that we need to keep an eye on because they may be changing as the need for education becomes more important to students and adults who really need to get back into a different and a rapidly changing job.
That's a good point, and I think in the afternoon session we'll probably have a conversation about what can we do to convince federal government, state governments, institutions in the private sector about the need for more investment. As Dr. Giles said, more and more jobs are going to be requiring some form of post-secondary training, and how do we convince policymakers when clearly there are constrained resources to be able to put more of them into post-secondary education and training. Dr. Flores?
I would also add, in terms of is it different today compared to other recessions, I would add that state profiles are dramatically different than they were since the last recession in 1990. So North Carolina, Georgia, they're just completely different states in terms of demographics than they were almost 20 years ago. And as a result, local labor markets have changed as well. So how these different state profiles adjust to demographic changes is going to be very interesting, especially in places like the South that haven't seen rates of immigration like this before. Traditional states like California, Arizona, New York, and